6:02 p.m., Tuesday, Mar-a-Lago. The gilded doors are shut, but the screams can be heard through the vents. This is not the sound of a campaign in motion. It is the sound of an empire in friction. Today, the unthinkable happened in the halls of the Capitol, not from the Democrats, not from the radical left, but from the very men and women who used to wear the red hats with pride. For the first time in 9 years, the Oust Trump movement isn't a liberal fantasy. It's a Republican memo. What I am about to show you is not a collection of rumors. It is not fake news or wishful thinking. It is a documented collapse of loyalty, a forensic breakdown of a political divorce that is turning violent in the shadows of the RNC. The man who demanded absolute loyalty is now finding that in Washington, loyalty has the shelf life of a gallon of milk in July. Stay with me, because what happens in the next 48 hours will decide if the Republican Party survives as a movement or dissolves into a historical cautionary tale. You need to see this. The first crack did not come from a loud speech or a dramatic press conference. It arrived in silence, a withdrawn vote on the House floor. Speaker Mike Johnson, who has spent the past year performing a delicate tightrope walk over a pit of MAGA fire, was forced to step back. And here is the important part. He did not retreat because of pressure from Democrats. He retreated because of a rebellion within his own party. The pressure had been building for some time. What was once described as the honeymoon of a second term has now turned into an open internal conflict. It began with tariffs, what critics inside the party bluntly call the Canada tax, policies that hit Midwestern states directly, where local economies cannot absorb another cost shock. But the real turning point was not policy. It was the numbers. A leaked internal memo showed Republican candidates trailing by double digits in battleground states, not because of weak messaging, not because of flawed campaign strategy, but because of the name at the top of the ticket. The cause was identified clearly: the president himself. From there, the signs became harder to ignore. A group of House Republicans openly defied the White House in a sensitive vote. Senate leaders expressed anger in private meetings as the president backed primary challengers against sitting members of his own party. And the whispers began to turn into deliberate statements. "He's leading us into a buzzsaw," one senior GOP aide reportedly said behind the scenes. What is striking is that this anger is not about ideology, it is about political survival. The Republican Party was once a unified fortress, held together by discipline, fear, and loyalty. But when polling shows independent voters turning away, when inflation erodes the retirement accounts of core supporters, and when the threat of losing the majority becomes real, the old rules begin to fail. The man who once claimed he could do anything without losing votes is now confronting a basic truth of American politics. There are two sins a party will never forgive: losing elections and damaging the economic security of its own voters. This is no longer a story about personal disagreement. It is a structural shift inside a political party where survival instincts begin to outweigh loyalty. And this is how an iron grip starts to slip, not with a dramatic rupture, but with the quiet withdrawal of the very hands that once held it tight. This is the moment everything changed, not because of a tweet, not because of a slogan, but because the math of power began turning against the man who once believed it would always be on his side. Donald Trump has long treated the White House not as a public trust, but as a personal fortress, a place where loyalty is measured by obedience, not by constitutional reasoning. And when cornered, he does what he has always done: he escalates. But this time, the escalation exposed the limits of power. He summoned key Republican leaders to the Oval Office, a meeting described by those inside not as a strategy session, but as a loyalty test. The president asked them to support an executive order that would redirect funding from the Department of Veterans Affairs into a border wall completion fund, effectively bypassing Congress's constitutional authority over appropriations. Article 1 of the Constitution is clear. The power of the purse belongs to Congress, not the White House, not social media. Congress. And for the first time in years, members of his own party said so out loud. Senator Susan Collins stepped out of that meeting and stated plainly, "The Constitution assigns the power of the purse to Congress. That is not optional. It is fundamental." That was not a personal attack. It was a structural reminder. Senator Thom Tillis, who has spent years navigating MAGA politics with caution, went further. Speaking to reporters, he said, "We made binding commitments to veterans. Redirecting those funds for a political symbol undermines trust. That's not conservative governance." Pause on that phrase, conservative governance. He wasn't arguing morality. He was arguing with management. And here is the critical point. The market reacted. Within an hour of the president attacking Tillis on Truth Social, calling him a rhino loser and a traitor, the Dow Jones dropped sharply, not because a policy had passed, but because instability within the governing majority had become visible. As one financial analyst put it on television, markets can absorb policy differences. They cannot absorb governing dysfunction. Governing dysfunction. That's the phrase. While the president waged his online battle, the House held a procedural vote, the kind that rarely makes headlines. But in Washington, procedural votes are where power is measured. 22 Republicans voted with Democrats. 22. In a razor-thin majority, that is not a deviation. It is a structural shift. Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries responded, "This House will not become an extension of any one person's political agenda." That was not a victory speech. It was an institutional warning. The president did not merely lose a vote. He lost control of the agenda. He lost the ability to guarantee party discipline. He lost what every president needs more than applause, a stable majority. And when the White House press secretary claimed the president was more popular than ever, the press room did not respond with outrage. It responded with laughter. In Washington, that kind of laughter can be more dangerous than protest. Even a newspaper that once defended him ran a skeptical headline, not because it had changed its ideology, but because it had read the numbers. This is no longer about personality or style. It is about constitutional limits and political reality. When a president still has ambition but no longer has certainty about his majority, power does not disappear overnight. It erodes through votes, through cautious statements, through unanswered phone calls. And in Washington, there is an unwritten rule. A party can forgive many things. It does not forgive losing elections, and it does not forgive chaos that damages its voters' economic security. The question now is not whether the president will continue attacking dissenters. The question is whether his party will continue paying the political price of standing beside him. That is not a television drama. That is the mathematics of power. What we witnessed today was not merely a legislative defeat. It was a structural rejection of the concept of the imperial presidency, the idea that the will of one person can substitute for the constitutional process. The vote on the border wall completion fund did more than cost the White House political capital. It stripped away the most effective tool of Donald Trump's power for nearly a decade, the fear of political punishment from within his own party. For years, even the hint of a primary challenge was enough to keep Republican lawmakers in line. This time, it wasn't. More than 40 House Republicans, according to internal sources, have formed a mutual defense mechanism against any Trump-backed challengers. That is not an ideological revolt. It is survival math. When approval among independent voters slides into dangerous territory, a presidential endorsement stops being a political asset. It becomes a political liability. The institutional correction. What truly stands out is not the social media attacks. It is the institutional response. The Department of Justice, designed to operate independently from political pressure, saw senior career officials resign rather than attach their names to actions they believed exceeded constitutional limits. That is not a loud protest. It is a documented one. with signatures and consequences. A federal court responded with a temporary restraining order reinforcing what Article 1 of the Constitution has always made clear. The power of the purse belongs to Congress, not as a suggestion, not as a talking point, as a foundational structure. The market spoke as well, not through speeches, but through numbers. As the S&P 500 hit its lowest point of the quarter, the message was unmistakable. Investors can tolerate policy disagreements, but they do not tolerate governing instability. The RNC, meanwhile, saw major donor contributions stall. In modern American politics, money is not just fuel, it is a measure of confidence. When the money steps back, it is conducting its own quiet referendum. Even the most loyal segment of the base is showing signs of fatigue. The intensity that once appeared untouchable is no longer at the same level. That is not betrayal. It is erosion. So the question is no longer whether Donald Trump will continue to fight. The question is how much power remains when a president cannot secure votes within his own party, cannot rely on the courts to expand his authority, and cannot be certain of financial backing. In Washington, power rarely disappears overnight. It wears down, vote by vote, donation by donation, phone call by phone call that goes unanswered. A party can endure controversy. It can endure a divisive style, but it cannot endure the risk of losing its majority. And when the self-interest of allies begins to outweigh personal loyalty, this stops being the story of one individual. It becomes a recalibration of power. In Washington, that is always the decisive moment. But what is changing here is not the temperament of the president. What is changing is the structure of power around him. So what does an isolated president do when his own party begins calculating a future without him? There are three scenarios being discussed very seriously, not on cable television, but in congressional offices and in the conference rooms of major donors. 1. The third-party strategy, leverage or self-destruction. The idea of a MAGA exit is no longer a vague threat. It is a bargaining tool. If Trump were to urge his most loyal supporters to stop funding the RNC and redirect their resources into a separate movement, he might not be able to build a third party strong enough to win. But he could accomplish something else, split the conservative vote in swing states. And in America's two-party system, that is not a strategy for victory. It is a strategy that virtually guarantees defeat for your own side. This is not about ideology. It is about arithmetic. If Trump's presence on the ballot costs Republican candidates in competitive districts a few decisive percentage points, then his endorsement becomes a liability rather than an asset. The question is not whether he could do it. The question is whether his party believes he is willing to. 2. The 25th Amendment, the power of a whisper. The mere fact that the 25th Amendment is being mentioned, even quietly, even hypothetically, carries more political weight than the practical likelihood of it being invoked. The 25th Amendment is extraordinarily difficult to trigger. It requires the cabinet and Congress. It requires overwhelming consensus. But in politics, sometimes what matters is not the action itself. It is the moment people begin to contemplate the action. If major GOP donors are questioning governing capacity, that does not automatically create a constitutional crisis. But it does create something else, organized doubt. And in Washington's power structure, when money begins to doubt, politics pays attention. 3. Legislative freeze, isolation by procedure. The most likely scenario is not dramatic. It is procedural. A Cold War between the West Wing and Capitol Hill does not require a formal declaration. It unfolds through bipartisan bills crafted with veto-proof majorities, through budget agreements reached without the White House at the center of the negotiation. When a Speaker of the House must choose between protecting the president and protecting a fragile majority, history suggests congressional leaders choose the majority because the majority is real power. Individuals are temporary. There is a subtle but important shift happening here. The question is no longer, can Trump continue to dominate his party? The question is, will his party continue to accept the risk of standing beside him? In American politics, power rarely disappears in a single explosion. It erodes through donations not made, through candidates who decline to run under a brand seen as toxic in swing districts. And when allies begin calculating self-interest over personal loyalty, this is no longer a story about leadership style. It is a redistribution of power. In Washington, that is always the final chapter of a weakening presidency. Not sudden collapse, but systematic isolation. And when that isolation becomes normalized, the end game stops being a slogan. It becomes a process. We have just lived through a week that history will record, not because of the noise, but because of the shift in power taking place beneath that noise. Why does this moment matter? Not because of a tweet, not because of a tense press conference, but because a core assumption of American politics has just been tested. And it did not survive the test. For years, there was an almost untouchable belief that personal loyalty to Donald Trump was stronger than party discipline, stronger than electoral math, and even stronger than constitutional structure, that he could bend institutions to his will simply through the weight of his loyal base. This week, we saw the limits of that assumption. The Oust Trump movement within the GOP did not emerge from a sudden moral awakening. Politics rarely runs on moral awakening. It runs on interest and survival. And when lawmakers begin to see the risk of losing their seats, when donors see the risk of losing their money, when markets see the risk of instability, personal loyalty begins to yield to the mathematics of power. That is what is happening. We are witnessing the return of a basic principle. Power in American democracy is borrowed power. It is lent by voters, lent by the party, and sustained by the ability to govern effectively. When that ability is questioned, power does not disappear overnight. It erodes through votes that are no longer guaranteed, through donations that are quietly withheld, through the silence of those who once rushed to television cameras to defend. Pay attention to that silence. Pay attention to the empty seats at rallies. Pay attention to the donors standing on the sidelines. Pay attention to congressional leaders speaking about institutions instead of individuals. That is not accidental. That is recalibration. At what point does this stop being a story about one man and start being a story about structure? We are at that point. A president may still hold formal authority, but if he no longer commands a stable majority within his own party, that authority becomes fragile. In Washington, nothing is more dangerous for a political leader than the moment when those around him begin calculating a future that no longer places him at the center. The party, if it can be called that, is over. What remains is the consequence. And in politics, consequences are always mathematical. The question now is not what he will say next. The question is, who will still be standing beside him as the numbers continue to shift? That is what to watch. That is where the real story is unfolding.